thank you to everybody who are attending today. Thank you very much for coming along to this, the second day of the University Climate Change COP26 and beyond, and today's second session. This session is called Energy in the Community. I'm chairing today. My name is Ian Grimes. I'm Director of Estates at the University of Hertfordshire and have a very keen interest in everything sustainability as far as the university is concerned, and have responsibility for the major buildings and the utilities, etc. And as we drive towards our own race to net zero, much of the implementation of those projects will be done through my own department. I'm really excited about today's session. Some really good speakers and some really good subjects, and really looking forward to hearing them, as I'm sure you all are. Just some housekeeping. We're asking for everybody to use the Q&A function. If you were to type your questions in the function, we'll see those come up, and then I'll ask those questions of the speakers at the end in the Q&A session. So just to introduce our speakers today, first of all, we have Professor Mike Page. He's a Professor of Cognitive Psychology at the University of Hertfordshire, and Mike's going to talk to us about Greentown and exploring the feasibility of zero fossil fuels in UK towns. Secondly, we'll hear from Nameerah Hameed, and she's going to be talking about transitioning to renewable energy. And lastly, we have Professor Johnsterzeker, who is the Ebenezer Howard Chair of Planning at the University of Hertfordshire, and he'll be talking to us about energy in new housing. So very much a focus around everything buildings and property and the community today, and really exciting to hear the speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Mike first of all, and he's going to speak to us about Greentown, which I'm very excited to hear. Me and Mike have known each other a long time, and we've been talking about things sustainable for about 10 years, I think, Mike. So I'm really excited to hear where you've got to in your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for Nana and Zoe, who put this together so efficiently. I'm going to share my screen, which has got my PowerPoint slide on it here. So we'll just check with you that that's all visible. How is that looking? Can you see that?
Yes, Mike.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Good. So as Ian said, my name is Mike Page. I am a professor of cognitive psychology, but in fact, my first degree was in engineering. So a lot of what you'll see here reflects those shared interests in engineering and psychology. So I'm going to talk to you, I'll give you a little bit of an overview here. Just advance the slide. So the overview, I'll give you a little bit of a background on the scale of the need for low carbon housing as part of a need for low carbon in general. I'll talk about a project which we ran at the university called the Cube project, which I started, as Ian said, about 10 years ago, a little bit more, and its extensions into talking about urban housing or any housing actually. And then I'll talk about some simulations which I've done, which go under the name of Greentown. I'll introduce the Greentown question, which is, can we live in green towns? I'll talk about some of the assumptions and the details behind those simulations. I'll talk about a model house, which is useful for us to do those simulations, and I'll talk about the results. And then I'll make some conclusions. So that's a little overview. Now, in terms of the need, you can see here, this is a recent chart which I got from, this was adapted by Glenn Peters at the 4C organization. And you can see there, those are carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, both since 1960 up until the current year, with projected for the current year put on the end in the form of a red dot. Now you can see here that carbon emissions have carried on growing. It's difficult to spot the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change here, which resolved to cut carbon emissions. It's difficult to spot the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. It's difficult to spot, which was adopted in 2005. It's difficult to spot the 2016 Paris Agreement. In other words, emissions have been going up all the time since we agreed to, since the political powers agreed to cut them, and that frames the need. The only cut we really have is a non-deliberate one owing to the pandemic, and even that, as you can see, is bouncing back. Where is all the CO2 that's causing the problems of global warming come from? Just a couple of illustrative graphs, which you could find many equivalent graphs, basically from the Western industrialized nations. These are the cumulative carbon emissions per capita from 1850 to 2021. If you took that back to 1750, the UK would race up this chart even further. But basically, we're the ones that are responsible. When I'm talking about we, I'm talking about me as a UK citizen. We're the ones primarily responsible for the CO2 that's causing the problems. And if you look at the second graph here, this is the deciles of disposable income. So the rich people on the right-hand side and the poorer people on the other side. And it is the, surprise, surprise, it is the richer people who are causing most of the carbon emissions. And in fact, the CO2 emissions from the people's, those people who are in the top 10% of earnings, the CO2 emissions from their flying only, which is the top two bars here, is about 3/4 of the entire CO2 emissions of the people in the lower decile. So it's rich nations and it's rich people in rich nations who are primarily the cause of the problem. What scale of policies is necessary? Well, a drastic scale is the answer, and obviously a scale that is at a level which is higher than that we've so far achieved, given the first set of graphs that I showed you. These are some example policies set out by Professor Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre and Uppsala University as well, for climate change research in Manchester, that is, and then Uppsala as well, where he also works. And these include some more radical commitments than are perhaps adopted by any of the major governments so far. And the one I will focus on, I mean, I talked about the flying as being one example, a frequent flyer levy because 70% of the emissions of, or 70% of the flights that are taken come from the 15% richest people. So there's a big imbalance in flights, but I'm not here to talk about flights. One of the things that Professor Anderson talks about is all new buildings to be passive house standard with on-site renewables. I won't talk so much about passive house, but I am going to talk about on-site renewables. Because you need to ask yourself, if we were serious about cutting carbon emissions, why, when you drive around and you see new houses going up, why do you not see anything that indicates that those would be zero carbon buildings, such as solar panel roofs and things like that? Most of the houses you can see being built, just about all of them, are not of that form. So we're basically just adding to the building stock of things which are not sufficient. So I did some work with my colleague Nadine Page. It's a coincidence that we have the same surname, as far as I know, going back about 10 years now. And we looked at, from a psychological point of view, it said that I was a cognitive psychologist, on what we call the hot topics: habits, opportunities, and thoughts. Now, I often talk about them, and I will talk about the opportunities first in this lecture, but I worked in human memory for a long time, and I realized that off topics is not a very good acronym, so they're called hot topics. And one of the ways in which we try to demonstrate to people that how they might cut their emissions, because what we want to do is demonstrate to people that there is a better way of doing things, and that better way is not all hair-shirted and involving gross deprivation and things like that. We wanted to show people that there are ways of doing these things. Those ways are already available with technologies that we have that are available. So in the Cube project, we decided to sort of do that in a fun way to demonstrate what was possible. So the Cube project, going back to 2009 now at the university, we had some money which the university made available, and we resolved to design, or I designed and we built, a compact home in which one person or a friendly couple, as it says here, could live comfortably with all the modern conveniences, but with a minimum impact on the environment. And we operationalized that as a sort of low carbon emissions or zero carbon emissions net, or net zero energy. And we did this not because we thought that everybody wanted to live in the Cube. The Cube buildings are small, compact buildings, so we could pick them up and take them to different exhibitions. But we did this not to ensure that everybody should live in a small building like that, but to demonstrate the best low energy techniques the best low energy technologies that were currently then available in 2009 and are still available that people could use in any size building. We aimed to make it energy or carbon neutral on average, with low resource use and low embodied energy. So we didn't want to use very high carbon materials to build it. Let me emphasize, we didn't expect everybody to live in a cube. Now, I've put what some of the important features of those buildings were, and I've put since 2009 or 2009 because that's deliberate. All of these things were built into the original cube in 2009. These are still things which would be a good idea 12 years later, and are still not done on the new buildings, most of which you'll see being built today. Or most of the new buildings that you'll see being built today. So we used a timber frame structure, low embodied energy. We used triple glazed windows. We had good insulation. We had low embodied energy because we were using timber that soaks up carbon. So sequesters carbon, as I've put it here. We had that wood was certified from good forests. We didn't use lime or cement or anything. We had an air source heat pump, which is a very good way of heating. It's high and efficient. I haven't got time to explain to you how it works, but you've got one in your fridge as it happens. But it's very low in emissions, and actually it gets better in its emissions as the grid becomes lower and lower carbon. So it can be decarbonized over time. We had heat recovery ventilation in the cube. We recovered waste heat from the heat that from the air that we were ventilating out of the cube, shower air or something like that. We had solar photovoltaic panels, PV panels on the southern. It doesn't have to be just the southern aspects, but anything between east and west. And even on something as small as the cube, which you'll see in a minute, we had 3 kilowatt peak of output from these solar panels, which would give you about 280 watts on average of electrical power all over the year. We also had a monopitched roof. We had a roof which was facing the right way to collect solar energy. Why do we not build houses routinely that are facing the right way to collect solar energy? And if they are facing the right way, why do we have dual pitched roofs instead of monopitched roofs? Why do we have steep roofs instead of shallow roofs? We had LED lighting, which in the subsequent 12 years has become more popular because it's highly efficient. It's got good color temperatures. You can get different so-called temperatures. It's dimmable. It's got no mercury in it like the previous version. We had AAA rated appliances, A+++ as they were. That energy labeling system is being redone at the moment. But we had all the best. So we had induction hob instead of fossil fuel cookers. We had LED TVs, and we had low flow water outlets. Hot water has got a lot more energy than cold water because you've had to heat it up. So we had low flow water outlets, particularly for the hot waters like showers. I emphasize that everything we chose could be used in any size building, okay? So it's not just for small buildings like this. We took the cube, the original, this is QB1, we took it up to Edinburgh, and this is it sitting outside Harvey Nicks in Edinburgh, which was a nice place to be. It was a lovely spring in April 2011. And you can see some, you can go to cubeproject.org.uk to see some of these buildings. This was a stretch version of that. This was 3 by 4 meters in plan, seen from above, and then 3 meters high. The first cube was a genuine cube, which was 3 by 3 meters on the inside. And that's the inside of QB2, the stretch one, four-seater table, double bed, full size, all mod cons and 0 carbon, but not so that everybody would live in a small space. This is me and on George Clark's Amazing Spaces. We've got about 10 minutes on George Clark. I'm the handsome one on the left there, just in case you were mixing us up. And we also took QB3, which was the third one. We had a very original naming system, obviously. We took QB3 up to the Edinburgh Science Festival in 2016, and that had some fun things like moving walls and things like that. Same volume, but all on one level for people with movement difficulties. So you can have a look at those on cubeproject.org.uk if you're interested. But we don't think that everybody should live in small buildings, compact buildings. This was done for convenience to show people how to do it. But we have a preliminary design. We've put together more than a preliminary design now. I've put together something called Sugar Cube House, which is based on like a 7 meter cube instead of a 3 meter cube. And it could be configured, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, as a 4-bedroom house or a flat with a maisonette above, and it could be terraced or semi-detached or detached. There's no windows on the side, so it can be terraced. And the sugar cube house is designed to be much better than energy or carbon neutral over the years. It's designed to generate more energy than it uses over a year. It's got low embodied energy, again, because it uses wood and things like that that don't have a high carbon input to manufacture the materials. And it's designed to be built in around 2 or 3 weeks, even with an inexperienced building team. That is the aim of it. That's a picture of one of the houses, which one of the shapes of houses. But notice there's a few things about this shape of house that optimizes it in terms of its renewable energy collection. It's got a monopitched roof. In fact, it's got 2 monopitched roofs. There's 100 square meters of area which you can direct towards the south, or anywhere between east and west, really, to pointing south, and that will collect an awful lot of energy just on the footprint of your house without any further space wasted. And this can be configured, as I say, as 2 flats or a 4-bedroom house. And there's there's a sun space on the towards the south, with big windows that can pick up low angle winter sun, and the insulation is actually in this wall, so you can close that sun space off when it gets cold of an evening. So the question, having designed all that sort of houses and having specified the sorts of houses that you'd need to be zero or low carbon, was how feasible is it to build a town full of these sorts of things? And so I simulated a sort of town of 10,000 sugar cube houses, 40,000 residents, 4 in each house. And I restricted myself to looking at what the energy balance would be. And we had weather data for a part in Coventry for every hour for the years 2011 through 2015, the 4 years. So we had weather data, temperature data, sun data for every hour. What are the energy sources for Greentown? Well, you've got the roof-mounted solar PV, you've got ambient heat, you've got heat in the gardens, as it were, which is also solar ultimately, which can be used for heat pumps. And outside of Greentown, this is a zero fossil fuel development, so we can allow ourselves access to a grid-connected wind resource. So if we've got wind turbines in the North Sea, we can have a part of that. But because there's 40,000 people in Greentown, we can have 40,000 divided by 64 million. So we can have our fair share of what's on the grid. Tidal might be on the grid, biomass, stuff that's being burnt with a short rotation, crops, locking up carbon and then releasing it again, or even nuclear has been talked about recently, particularly these things called small modular reactors. So that's the sources of energy that you can use, zero fossil fuel for Greentown. What are the energy demands? Well, you've got domestic energy supply, which is keeping the lights and the computer on here. And you've got heating and hot water. And we know the temperature outside and we know the temperature inside for every hour because we're keeping a stable temperature inside. And we know how efficient a heat pump would be under those circumstances. So we can say exactly how much energy Greentown would be using every hour for 4 years. And we make the conservative assumption that all the houses would be detached. They wouldn't be detached. They could be some of them terraced. And to the extent that they're terraced, they're not losing heat out of the side walls. And therefore, everything will be better than I will say it's going to be. We know from huge surveys that the electricity demand varies in a very regular way across the day. This is 1 o'clock in the morning, people get up for breakfast and then they come home at evening. We know that variation is very regular, and we know exactly, so we know how much electricity Greentown would be using every hour of every day, and we know how much heat it would be using. And we can put all of this into an energy balance, and we can say, given how much Greentown can generate and get from the North Sea or whatever, and how much it's using, what's the balance going to be? And are we ever going to get into a deficit? And if we are, we're going to need some energy storage, yeah? So if Greentown's not going to pass the buck, and they're not allowed to turn on a fossil fuel resource, it needs to be zero carbon at all times. And this means we've got to store energy, perhaps at timescales which are approaching months, okay? So the big question is, how big would a battery need to be to allow Greentown, this town of 40,000 people, not necessarily an electrochemical battery, it could be pumped water or something like that. So just remind you about the house. It's got a monopitched roof, which is optimized for collecting solar energy. It's got 100 square meters of that, which gives it 12 kilowatts peak of solar PV, which is a lot. So there's going to be an excess at some times that can be used for fueling your cars or producing hydrogen or whatever. It's got this uninsulated sun space, which gets warm when the sun's shining and you can move the warm air, but it gets cold at night and therefore can be shut off from the house. That's a good thing. It gives you passive solar gain in the winter because the sun angles in here, but there's shading here in the summer. At midday on Midsummer's Day, the shadow of these solar panels falls against the start of the other solar panels. So they never shade each other, but they give you window shade, for instance. The walls, building regulation walls. I'm not simulating anything passive house standard here, although one could, and it would get better. And we recover half the heat that we throw out with the air. When we take shower air out of the shower, we recover half of that heat. So we model it as a detached house, but some of them would be terraced. And we know that we're going to have 10,000 houses, each with 12 kilowatts of solar energy on them. So that's 12 megawatts of peak of photovoltaics. And not all of them have to be south. Some of them, half of them could be facing south. And then in a terrace, in a crescent, anywhere between east and west pointing south. And so we modeled that they don't all have to be in rows looking very regimented. Even east-west, even something pointing west picks up 87% of the sun that something optimally oriented to the south does. We've got meteorological data for the 4 years. I got some data from Coventry because it's about in the middle of the UK. And we can estimate how much the solar panels would actually get from the sun shining. We've got solar radiation data from Coventry, but we can, fortunately on the internet, there are people who put up how much their PV is actually generating. And this is a plot of how much sun was shining according to the weather station in Coventry and how much a guy in Leicester was getting off his roof. And you can see that there's a fairly good linear plot. I mean, Leicester's not the same place as Coventry, so it's not entirely linear. But we can estimate now from our weather data how much real solar panels, so this is not optimized, this is how much real solar panels would be getting out. We know we can look on gridwatch.co.uk to find out how much wind is blowing on the North Sea, and we can, I was taking these data from 2011 to 2015, but we can actually extend it through to future years because the wind fleet is getting bigger and bigger. But we're only allowed our fair share, remember. We're not allowed to take more than our fair share of these grid wind resources. And in fact, when we multiply up and we just pretend that it's a sort of linear, we actually overestimate how much variability. The more wind farms you put, the less variability you get because it's normally blowing wind somewhere. Okay, this is actually the wind distribution for a typical year, 2015. These are the power that was being produced by the fleet, and this is how many hours. So you can see that it's dominated by low powers for more hours, and then there's some extreme powers for a very few hours. So this is the 8,760 hours in a year, sort of counted out across how much power was being produced. And there we are. We can do this. I can see that Ian, so I'm going to just give you the results and then wind up. We can do this here. We've got the 4 years of renewables here, the sun and the wind, and you can see that they're slightly out of kilter. There's more wind in the winter and less sun, and more sun in the summer and less wind. So that's good. If you have both, then you can work it out. And then we have storage, which is conceived of a series of batteries and small ones in cars, just taking up daily, and then a big battery. And the thing that we've got to decide is how big a battery do we need in order to keep Greentown going all the time without using fossil fuels. And I'm measuring the size of the battery. My reveal will be in Wembley IKEAs. So that's 1 meter deep in the floor plan of just the ground floor of Wembley IKEA. That's the size of the battery. Now you can have a guess as to how big the battery needs to be, because I'm about to tell you. For 40,000 people, it turns out that the battery needs to be only 3/4 of the size of the ground floor of the Wembley IKEA, the shop only, not including the car park. So the battery doesn't need to be super big, okay? And just using some typical example numbers, if we got 3 times as much wind as we've got in 2015, we're already at two times. If we've got electrical storage efficiency, this goes from pumped storage at 70% to lithium ion at 95%. If we've got solar panels at £1,000 per kilowatt peak, it's less than that already. If we've got a big battery at around about $100 per kilowatt hour storage, It's around, it's getting towards that in cars at the moment. If the battery density, well, this is typical battery density of how much we can store, then we end up, and we've got some base load like nuclear or tidal on there. I've estimated 3 gigawatts, but in fact, we've got 5 to 6 on the grid today. And this is what you get. In most of the times, at all of those times, for those sorts of illustrative figures, Greentown is in a massive energy surplus, and it's only in the winters here that you've got an energy deficit. And if you look about how much was in the battery over those times, you basically can't build a battery big enough to store the excess that you've got in the summer. So you top the battery out, and then you use the energy from the battery in the winters. And in 3 out of 4 of those winters, you can see that the battery never emptied. In one of them, it did a bit, so you could turn something on there. But in one of them, one of the winters was a warm winter, so you never got anywhere near. If I go back to the previous slide, you'll see that this deficit here. There was a warm winter here, so there's hardly any deficit in the winter here. There's a bigger deficit here and here. Okay, so that's averaged over 4 years. You can see that you just need a battery that size. So homes, houses, buildings, buildings of any size, in fact, are a really good renewable energy resource if we build them properly when we build them. Now, we need to build about 4 million homes, or at least we did before Brexit, in the years up to 2030 to house everybody. And if you had 3 million buildings like the Sugar Cube house I'm showing you, and there's nothing special about the Sugar Cube house other than it's actually thought about what you'd want to do, you could provide 36 gigawatts of solar without any extra land being applied at all. And that's 3 times what we've got now. So you'd have we'd have 4 times what you've got now with no additional land, just building these homes properly from the start. And buildings are an excellent place to put the generation because that's where you're using the energy. I've got 1 more minute. Energy storing is the key remaining thing, energy storage. We probably wouldn't want to use batteries, but there are, because they're very expensive. Even using a lithium-ion battery, Greentown was not going to be more expensive than the current bills. So it's not going to be expensive, and the technology is already there. But there are other much cheaper things you could do. You could store the energy in hot water. This is a tank which was built in 2007 in Munich, in Am Ackermannbogen. That was at €3 per kilowatt hour of storing energy as heat in a big tank of hot water, which was then covered in an earth mound and used as a playground. We were talking €100 per kilowatt hour for the battery. So there's low-tech things we can do. The pumped storage that is available in the Great Glen of Scotland. This is a wonderful site by the Australian Renewable Energy Authority. That's also available to us. We don't need to use lithium-ion batteries. So the question I will leave you with is, why are we not building green towns? Why everywhere you look are houses going up that are not optimized in this way, that are not using technologies we've already got? Don't look to nuclear fusion. Look to technologies that we were even I was talking about in 2009. This is a political question. This is not a technological question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was really interesting and great to remember back to the Cube project. And I remember the day we delivered it to campus very well. I think your question at the end there is obviously a pertinent one. Why are we not building Greentown? All of these technologies exist. All of this design exists. It's interesting. Your picture had copyright Mike Page on the picture of the house. But there's really nothing that amazing about what you put forward there, as you said. Exactly. So I've got my own thoughts why we're not building Greentown. Do you want to expand a little on that? Why you feel we are where we are?
Johnsterzeker, who's also on the call, knows that I would, if given the chance, and I won't do this, I would expound on it for the next hour, but I'm not going to do that. I would point out, and I need to be a little bit careful because we're on a public thing here. I would point out there are a lot of people making a lot of money, corporations and individuals, out of building very poor houses at 40% profit margins. And until we stop that massive incentive to people who are able to do that. So what they do is they sell you a house that is poorly made. It's not going to be zero carbon, but it's going to need to be retrofitted now by you. And they're not going to pay for that retrofitting. You're going to pay for it because you've now bought the house off them. And so there are a lot of people making a lot of money out of making very poor energy efficient houses from an energy efficient perspective, and probably from a design perspective as well, if we're honest. And there has been some what we call regulatory capture. They have captured the minds of the regulators, and I won't speculate as to how they've done that. Otherwise, I'll get myself into trouble.
No, I think profitability is obviously a major factor, and also customer practice of house buying in the UK, I think, is a challenge that is difficult to overcome. I think it's very interesting when we see greenhouse projects, passive house type projects as well. They're often one house, and they're not being repeated and being built into 200, 300, 400. They're individual projects, which is not the way to actually create efficiency. And I think that's something else we need to challenge. Really good, Mike. I myself thought a lot recently about outside the fence and the infrastructure that we need as we go towards more electric heating and air source heat pumps, etc. The infrastructure needs to improve with us, and I see storage as a game changer as well. I really think storage is the future. So, thank you very much, and we'll now move on to our next speaker, which is Nameerah Hameed, and she's going to talk us about transitioning to renewable energy. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be in this company today. I'll try to first introduce my work and my background. So I'm a policy specialist by profession, and I work in the clean energy nexus with some bits of climate and also gender. And I say gender because I run a non-profit organization called Women in Energy Pakistan. It's a professional network for women in the fields of energy, climate, and the broader power sector, with the reach of 5,000 female professionals in the country and also wider South Asia region. So the work that I'm currently doing is in the nexus of energy, climate, and policy in London. The work primarily revolves around creating an urgency towards climate justice, where it has a twofold focus. One is local community engagement for climate action. And then the second stream is to work towards ensuring climate justice within the dialogues that take place at a local level, but also at a global level. Previously, I worked a lot on energy transition, especially at a subnational level in Pakistan, working on advising the subnational government on how to transition towards adopting more renewable energy technologies and having a more balanced energy mix. And I studied at the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. So I have a sort of multi-country experience for the topic that I want to talk about today. I was asked to connect my section to COP26 and some of the dialogues and conversations that took place at the COP. I was pleased to be part of the COP26 for a couple of days. I spoke at a UK presidency program panel and was a part of some of the other conversations. So I'll try to link a few of those today in this in my section today. So just as a sort of overview, what is the clean energy transition? It's restructuring the current energy systems at global, national, and community levels and creating pathways to low carbon futures, adopting renewable energy technologies and, at the same time combating climate crisis. So it's not just a shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It's actually, restructuring the political constants. It's using renewable energy to improve state zone security, energy security. And so it allows us to have energy lose its potency as the geopolitical instrument we have known it to be for decades. So if we had to sort of provide four key points, it would be pushing for more renewables, since solar and wind are cost competitive with conventional energy sources. It's need for an increased system flexibility with the addition of more intermittent power. It's using natural gas to provide the transition fuel, and that's it. And also along with the demand side management and storage options to continue investing in those. Connecting this to COP and then the COP context of COP26. As we know, this COP that the UK hosted was very different and much bigger than the ones before. The urgency of climate action has been realized to the point that there is a general sense of panic around the topic of climate urgency. And just as a recap, in Glasgow, we did see leaders from more than 100 countries representing around 85% of the world's forests to end deforestation by 2030. We saw pledges from more than 100 countries to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. We saw more than 40 countries commit to a shift away from coal in pledges made at the summit. We, in separate commitments, also saw 20 countries, including the US, pledge to end public financing for unabated fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 2022. And perhaps most surprisingly was also that we saw United States and China, the world's two largest emitters, unveil a deal to ramp up and boost climate cooperation over the next decade. But considering the urgency of what we have in front of us, this is not enough at all. If the current climate policies around the world are considered rather than the climate goals, global warming would still rise to 2.7 degrees centigrade based on the most recent assessment by Climate Action Tracker, a climate analysis coalition. So in that sense, COP26, the analysis around it gets a bit more negative and dismal. So we start seeing that there was a lot of countries that were lobbying to sort of reduce the urgency for this clean energy transition. We saw that some countries, including India, weakened a crucial clause on fossil fuels at the last minute. We saw that the country's lead negotiator requested a call to escalate efforts to phase down unabated coal power and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We saw that countries dreaded the prospect of unmet energy demand, which would stunt their economic growth. In this case, we saw that China joined India in pushing for a weakened phase down of coal at COP. The two countries have historically felt a sense of injustice, that their leaders feel that the Western countries have been blazing through mountains of coal on their way of becoming industrialized, and it's unfairly trying to prevent the global South from doing the same. So in this sense, we see some countries pushing for their own national priorities. And we see that the negotiations that took place at COP26 were not enough at all for a global energy transition and catalyzing the energy transition. In this context, it's also important that I throw some light on the conversations and the dialogues and how the negotiations take place within the COPs and how they take place historically. What we see is that historically, while negotiations take place, there has been a shocking absence of expert voices from the global South in climate negotiations and also the wider climate change discourse. We see a continuation of a legacy of colonialism within the global politics, where the global North is seen to be speaking to the global South instead of it being a two-way conversation. So at the panel that I was a part of, we spoke about the power of public engagement for harnessing climate action towards clean energy transition and co-creating solutions for this collective future on this planet. And raising the questions about how can we ever authentically engage the public and also the wider communities on climate justice without including the voices and leadership of people most impacted by climate change. So in this sense, we want that businesses and governments from the global North take ownership of this crisis as collective that they have collectively created, and need to step up in more and meaningful ways. I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into one case study or one example of colonialism that we see continuing in the clean energy transition. And I really liked a recent piece from the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute, who speaks about this need for climate justice and energy transition. So he basically, this piece basically talked about Norway and how, along with 7 other Nordic and Baltic countries, Norway has been sort of lobbying the international donor agencies to stop financing natural gas projects in Africa and elsewhere as soon as 2025. And until then, only in exceptional circumstances should they be used. So we also saw that at COP26, 20 countries went even further, pledging to stop all funding for overseas fossil fuel projects beginning next year. And instead, the Nordic and Baltic countries suggest the donor agencies should finance clean energy solutions in the developing world, such as hydrogen and small microgrid networks. So what we see is that the idea that some of the poorest people in the world will start using green hydrogen, possibly the most complex and expensive energy technology that exists, and building smart microgrid networks in just a few years is not practical at all. So we see that in these cases, some of the conversations that take place at the UN, they list natural gas among clean energy sources and promoting the switch to cooking gas in the context of the SDGs, which call for global access to affordable clean energy. Just sort of putting this into context, we see while Norway has been pushing, clean energy sources to be used in the global south, at the same time, the Norwegian Prime Minister argued that future oil and gas drilling will be critical to a transition to renewable energy. So in other ways, that Norway knows gas is needed, yet doesn't want poor countries to produce that gas. In this sense, Norway is advancing the sort of a green version of colonialism, and the problem isn't just Norway, it's the global north telling the global south on how this clean energy transition should take place. So my intention with this sort of context setting was not to single out Norway, but to give an example of how this may seem like a very scathing commentary, but it's important to examine the nuances of clean energy transition and how we set about with and with what intentions do we set about dictating how clean energy transition should take place. So this global holistic climate justice context is very, very important when looking at any clean energy transition at a community level or at a global level. Just in terms of public engagement, because that's also something linking to clean energy transition and COP26 and climate justice. So all of that sort of just wrapping it up together, I feel like public engagement is super, super key. And that is one of the catalysts that is being used to set higher goals for a clean energy transition or for climate action. What was very interesting, and I'm sure a lot of us noticed, was that any climate negotiation that take place, those that wield the power to negotiate and make decisions on the future of this planet, we see are mostly old, they're mostly male, and they're mostly white. Whereas the groups which are most likely to be impacted by climate change are the future generations. They're predominantly women and children, and they're predominantly living in the global south. So given this context, the present climate movement and the present sort of pressure from public that we see outside of the COP negotiation rooms, it's much younger. In Europe, in Africa, in South Asia, wherever, it's much younger, it's much more diverse, and it's female-led. So just given this context of where the pressure from the public will be coming from for the private sector and for the governments, I feel that's such a very hopeful and much more sort of energetic place to be coming from. And this is where we should place our trust and our joint efforts towards. And with that, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Nameerah. Just starting my camera. Thank you very much. Really interesting. It's great to have that direct feedback coming straight out of COP26 for us to hear today from your experiences. We had a question in the chat actually come from Philip, and he's asked, given the relatively poor outcomes from COP26, what suggestions are in existence for averting climate despair? And Phil goes on to ask, what avenues are there open to keep the Paris commitments alive? What do you feel about that, Nameerah?
That's an excellent question, and I think very briefly that I mentioned towards the end, COP26 was very demotivating to attend throughout the 10 days, and there was a lot of hope pinned for the negotiations, and those didn't come through. And I feel what I said towards the end, the public engagement bit is where I put a lot of my hope. So the stricter and the louder the public is engaged for demanding more from governments and private sector, I feel like the more governments and private sector or the world leaders will feel pressured enough to submit. What was very interesting to see was that there was a huge contingent of representatives from fossil fuel companies present at COP this time in Glasgow, which is taking away space from people traveling from the global south to these negotiations. But having said that, the other view to this could also be that for the first time, fossil fuel industries felt threatened enough to be present at these conversations. Previously, they wouldn't think it important enough to even be there. So for the first time, there is a general consensus of panic, of not doing enough for climate action, that we see world leaders literally shaken to do more. We saw even the UK President Boris Johnson quoting Greta Thunberg's blah, blah, blah in his official speech that he gave at the COP, which was very interesting because clearly the world leaders do feel that they're being put under a stricter measurement against, which they will be judged. So I feel like, given, your question, given the relatively poor outcomes from COP26, where we should be looking at, or where we should be putting our efforts and trust towards, is this climate movement, which is taking place outside of the negotiation room.
Well, that's excellent, and I think it's great that the leaders are being held to account, and they are starting to fear that and see this as a real problem, and rather than a political stance. I think we are seeing a shift, but still maybe not a bigger shift as we'd all hope for. So thank you very much for Nameerah for your excellent talk. We'll move on to the third speaker now, which is Professor Johnsterzeker, who is the Ebenezer Howard Chair of Planning at University of Hertfordshire. And John's going to talk to us about energy and new housing. So sort of bring around the loop really back to where we start with Mike and Greentown, which is a theoretical town that exists in Mike's mind. Maybe John can now talk to us about what's happening in the world of planning and how that's being looked at as energy in new housing. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I think it's fair to say my presentation links very well with Mike's, perhaps less well with Nameerah, which I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Nameerah, really talking about some very important issues. So apologies for the fact I'm zooming back in, largely looking at the UK, but some of the things that I've got to say are of international relevance, and I'll draw that out where I can. Okay, so I am going to share my screen and do a presentation. So I will just get that going. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to assume that you can't, so let's go. Just bear with me a second. There we go. Right, so as Ian said, I'm John Sturzaker. I'm the Ebenezer Howard Professor of Planning here at the University of Hertfordshire, and I've had this post since April this year. It's a newly created post, taking its name obviously from Ebenezer Howard, who many people think was the first planner. So I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to have this post, and really pleased to be here in Hertfordshire, and really pleased to be invited to come along today. So thank you very much for inviting me. So I guess just a little bit more about me before I get on to the topic. So I'm a planner by background. I'm a fellow of the Royal Town Planning Institute. I think planning is a good thing. I think planning is important. And I think planning can help with some of the problems that we've heard about today. But as I'll go on to talk about, it isn't particularly helping as of now, I don't think. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that's the case. But my own particular research interests are in things like this, so in planning for housing, community planning, empowering people to have more of a say on developments where they live, but trying to make sure that the quality of those developments is perhaps a little bit better than it has been. So I knew Mike was talking today, so and that he would be covering some of the excellent things that he did cover. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, or any detail, in fact, on the technologies and things that Mike talked about. I'm basically going to look at why the things that Mike was talking about, solar energy as standard on houses, better insulation, triple glazing, et cetera, all the great technologies that Mike talked about and that we've, as he said, known about for years, are not standard on all new housing in the UK, or specifically in England. So I'm going to briefly talk about the problem that's been covered already, but just to sort of put my slant on it, and then say what I think are the causes for that, and then talk about a couple of possible solutions. So what is the problem? Well, we know about climate change and the challenges that is bringing. In a paper that I co-wrote back in 2017, we drew on some data showing the role that cities, and by cities I don't just mean mega cities, also towns, villages, anywhere that we live, through buildings, infrastructure, and transport, produce 40 to 70% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So anthropogenic is stuff coming from us, humans, and the figure is quite broad there, 40 to 70%, because it partly depends how what you include in that, how you measure it, and it varies between place to place. But even if it's only 40%, that's a very big chunk of greenhouse gas emissions, and if it's 70%, it's an enormous chunk. So making our cities function better, making the places we live emit fewer greenhouse gases is, for me, very clearly an important priority. And the UK government, as are most other governments worldwide, politically and legally committed to radically reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, through the things that Mike talked about and Nameerah talked about, the Paris Agreement, most recently COP26. So that's pretty clear, and it has been, as Mike said, and Nameerah said, for many years. The UK government is also in the position of attempting to address what it calls the housing crisis by building lots more houses. Their target is for 300,000 a year. But the problem, one of the problems that there is that the vast majority of the new homes that are being built in this country are built using technology from, I've said 50 years ago. Mike sometimes talks about it being from 100 years ago, old technology. And to the environmental standards of 20 or more years ago. So they're still relying on mains gas. The government is committed to phasing out gas boilers by whatever it is. But there's no need to be using gas boilers now in the new houses that we build. They could be all using heat pumps that Mike talked about. So they rely on environmentally unfriendly mains gas and electricity, rather than solar panels and other forms of local renewable energy generation. And they're prone to overheating in the summer because they're not very well designed. And the government made this worse, actively made it worse, by abolishing the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was brought in by the preceding Labour government, which imposed reasonably good standards for new houses. And they got rid of that in 2015 on the basis that that was reducing the number of houses being built, or that it was reducing the profit, or what they call viability, that house builders were making from new houses. So that stopped local councils enforcing higher standards in 2015. And this is obviously having climate change implications, but it's also having other implications, health implications, as people suffer from rising temperatures, and that's obviously only going to get worse. And there is a huge cost to individuals and the Exchequer. The UK government estimated at a massive £400 billion, and that's from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government-funded body, to pay for retrofitting all of these houses with the kind of technologies that Mike talked about. So it's a massive, enormous £400 billion, massive financial cost, as well as the climate change and health and other negative implications. So that's in terms of the technology. There's other aspects to energy and housing, of course, and I'm not going to extensively talk about this because this will be covered in the transport section happening later today. But this is from a report by Transport for New Homes in 2020, and they looked at a lot of the settlements that were being built and called garden communities, garden villages, garden towns, garden cities in recent years around the UK. And we're pretty critical of them. And this is a photo from the report and a quote saying, do these people live on a street or a car park? We saw new estates for garden towns which really had hardly any garden. And they looked into it a bit more, and they, again, another image from the report showing all the nice words that were in the visions that they read, saying things like leafy, local jobs, excellent community facilities. And then that's all wrapped up in a ribbon coloured by the UK motorway symbol. And this is the quote. I'm not going to read it out, you can see it for yourself, but basically they talked a good game, these developments, but the reality was that they all hinged on a massive expected rise in car use. So pretty dismal stuff. You know, the things that Mike talked about are not happening. Why, basically? What's my key question I'm going to come on to next? Why is this happening? Well, it's not just in the UK. I'm being fairly damning about the UK government and the UK situation, but there are problems all around the world. A common problem with policies that try and change urban form and design, so try and change the places that are being built to make them more sustainable, are, we found in 2017, overwhelmingly targeted at just one group of actors, developers and landowners. And I'll come back to the problem with that in a moment. And then in the UK, we do have particular problems in that big house builders who build about 88% of housing in the UK in recent years. This is from a government-sponsored report from earlier this year. Don't compete on the basis of new houses. So they don't compete with other house builders saying, our houses are much better than theirs, like in any other industry. So if you're buying a car or you know, a phone or a bar of chocolate or whatever, the competition is, this is the best bar of chocolate, this is the best car, this is the best washing machine or whatever. That's not what house builders compete on. Most new houses are pretty much the same. They compete in the market for land. So they make money by buying land cheaply and then selling, building houses on it and selling those houses at a fairly high cost. For the individual plots of land being massively more expensive than the agricultural land that it was before. So they're not particularly interested in building lots more houses, nor are they particularly interested in building better houses. Interesting quote here, just to finish on this one that I found. So back in 2016-17, landowners in England made £13 billion profit from land sales, more than double the total profits of Amazon, McDonald's and Coca-Cola put together at that time. So the market in land is hugely profitable. So there's very little incentive for anybody to make the things that go on the land any better. So that's a particular UK thing. But coming back to the first point about the problem with policies, this somewhat complex diagram, and it's complex because it's trying to represent a complex thing, is a diagram that we called a socio-ecological model of the urban development process. So this is from a European Union funded project that I was involved with in the early 2010s called Sustainable Urban Metabolism for Europe. And we were trying to look at urban development all across Europe and essentially work out how it could be made more sustainable. And we developed this model to try and say, well, what's actually going on? We see the outputs, and I just showed you, a picture of a housing development. How do you get to that? What's the process by which that sort of thing is delivered? And this diagram illustrates our view of that process. So it's what's going on here. The built environment is the bit in the middle in the red box. And then you've got production on the left-hand side, consumption on the right-hand side. And all of the boxes are different groups of influences on what goes on. So on the left, you've got producers, the house building industry and related organizations, users, the people who actually live in these things, regulators, which includes planners, lobbyists who might be lobbying for more development or anti-development, depending the context. Then various structures that surround them, things like the interests and values of society, rules, legislation, and so on. And then similarly in consumption, you've got similar sorts of sets of things, structures and mechanisms, actors and interests. And then in the middle, you have the built environment as gets generated, including buildings, land use, the things that connect those, roads, power grid, etc., and the open spaces that surround them, and then the key environmental flows across from them. So you don't have to kind of understand or unpick this diagram at this point. What really I'm showing you is just to illustrate how complex it is, and how the problem that I mentioned on the previous slide, that all policy packages or all approaches, or most of them, to deal with improving the sustainability of urban form, just concentrate on this little box in the top left-hand corner, producers. That's what they target. Planning policies target them. Building regulations policies target them. None of the rest of these influences. So, unsurprisingly, things don't tend to change. And what we found was that what seems to be missing, and this is a quote from our paper, is the formulation of complementary policy packages which work in harmony with a coordinated institutional framework, targeted at all relevant actors with the clear aim of moving towards a more sustainable urban metabolism. So we're trying to align everything so it all goes in the same direction. And that is not, in general, what happens at the moment. So, the UK being a kind of classic example of that, where you've got planning policy saying one thing, fiscal policy saying something quite different in terms of how easy it is to buy a car and drive around in your car rather than use public transport, for example. So what's the solution to this? How do we get more of the type of houses that Mike was talking about and fewer of the type of houses that I've shown in this presentation being built? Well, the first option is more and better state intervention. So a completely revised and extended package of policies from the UK government or any other government, the same thing applies almost everywhere in the world, which are packaged to fit the purpose. So they include regulation that we have now, but they also include incentivization, so financially incentivize people to do things, or other types of incentivization, direct provisions, so where the state is actually doing things, buying land and putting in infrastructure, for example, maybe building houses, education and awareness raising, and behavioral change. So things that are not just targeted at the people building the houses, but targeted at the people living in them. We target all relevant actors, as I say, we do need tighter regulation on developers. That's my view. You could look at what's happening and say the problem with the housing that's being built is we have too much planning, but the government in the last 10 years has radically deregulated the planning system. So I don't think you can look at what's happening now and say that's a consequence of too much planning. I think it's the other way around. But it's equally important to target end users, and in doing so seek to address users' behaviours and social practices. So reflect the science that we know about and understand how to influence behaviour that, again, we know about. Mike and colleagues in psychology, lots of really good work on how you influence people and try and get them to change what they do. So this approach, based on our research, would probably work, but it is in the opposite direction of UK government travel, and indeed not just this government, previous governments as well. And it's worth remembering that in the weeks before COP26, the UK government made it cheaper to drive cars by reducing fuel duty, and cheaper to fly by reducing air duty. So making difficult choices and doing challenging political things is not something that I think is particularly likely. So, that's pretty depressing. What else can we do? Well, we can do a number of things. Mike's made the point that this is a political problem, and indeed it is. So we can demand change from politicians. And Nameerah said some really encouraging, positive things about how the next generations are being more vocal on, in those demands, and that's great if that happens. We can demand change from house builders. So we're buying these new houses. If we don't like them, if they're not environmentally sustainable enough, we can say we're not buying this crap. We want something better. But we can do other things. We can think about getting together with other people in our community and look to build our own houses. And that might be literally using your own hands to build something, or it might be commissioning builders to build something to your design as a group or as an individual. And we're currently looking into the prospect of setting up what we've so far called an eco-community housing hub probably need a better name, that we would include test beds for businesses like Mike's and others, trying to generate new forms of building. But it would also include training for communities and individuals on how to do some of this stuff, and education. So we're a planning school. We know about planning. We can help. We can educate and train individuals and communities on key aspects of the housing and development process. And coming, full circle back to where I started, this I think would recapture the spirit of Ebenezer Howard, writing in 1898, and he called for, in the words of Professor Peter Hall, pro-municipal experiments or self-help. So Ebenezer Howard's idea 122 years ago was that people would build their own homes, 123 years ago, sorry, would build their own homes rather than the state building or private sector building. So maybe we can get back to something like that. So just to summarize, energy use in urban areas is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, with new urban development in turn contributing significantly to that. And this is a problem everywhere, not just the UK, but we have particular issues in this country due to our prevailing model of house building and a laissez-faire, hands-off, deregulatory approach to controlling house building. And we can lobby for that to change, and I think we should, and I hope that we continue to do so. But we can also explore more radical alternatives and take control and try and change things for ourselves. So that's the end. There's some references to follow up, which I'm happy to circulate afterwards for anybody who wants to learn more. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to having a good discussion now. I'll stop sharing my screen and come back into the thing. So thank you very much.
Hi, Ian. Are there any questions in the chat that you wanted to ask to our panelists? Can you hear me okay, Ian?
Looks like there might be a technical problem with Ian.
Oh dear.
He's got no sound. Okay. Well, perhaps while Ian tries to resolve that, shall we have a look at the Q&A ourselves and see if there's anything to...
Yeah, let's have a
is that okay?
Very good.
So do you want to do it, Zoe? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's a question for John here from Phil. Given the mass house building going on right now, what hope do you have that we will avoid locking ourselves into high emissions and or expensive retrofitting? I see no appetite from local authorities or central government.
Well, I think there is appetite for local authorities, but they find it, their hands are tied, in my view. And I would say this, being a planner, I have a lot of sympathy for local authority planners. I think the government, as I say, tied their hands by abolishing things like the Code for Sustainable Homes that gave them more power to require that developers did things. Sorry, that's my thing telling me to stop talking. What was I saying? No, so I don't, frankly, Phil, I don't have a great deal of hope if we're reliant on the big house builders. And some of the things they do are good and some of the house builders are better than others, so I don't want to tar them all with that brush, but I don't have a great deal of hope. I think we are, whatever the word you use was, sort of baking in these problems and just adding to that, I think it was 400 billion, staggeringly high retrofitting costs. So no, I worry that is where we're going. It's only going to get worse in the next few years. Sorry to be pessimistic, it's a bit grim.
Sorry, everybody. I think, can you hear me again now?
Yeah, we're all good now, Ian.
Oh, yeah, I lost you. Yeah, John, thank you. Really interesting. I wanted to ask a similar but different question around energy ratings on houses. I was reading that 84% of new houses are actually achieving an A or B rating, albeit I think the majority will be B rather than A. Do you feel if the government intervention was to make A mandatory, is that enough? Is there enough difference between A and B, or is it increasing the 84% up to 100%? Is that where the solve? Because actually, we've seen houses are, whilst we've been quite critical house builders today, houses today are much better insulated and they are achieving much better energy ratings, and then they're compared to 10, 20 years ago, they're by far better. And also the impact of removal of the code in 2015. How impactful was that, do you think?
No, good questions, Ian. I mean, I have to say I'm not an expert in some of the sort of coding and so on, but several aspects of that. So I think, yes, we should be trying to get more A's than B's. I think we should be increasing the tightness of those standards. I think it's relatively easy to build things that are okay but not brilliant and still get an A rating. I think some of the things that Mike's talked about should be standard. I don't know why they aren't. It's not hugely expensive to do some of this stuff, why every new house doesn't have solar panels on, for example, is beyond me. So yes, I acknowledge that there are improvements, but I still don't think it's good enough. And I think talked about gas boilers and things. I'm not going to belabor the point, but I feel like there's a lot of scope for things to be better, basically. So moving more B's into A's, as you say, getting it to 100% A, but also raising those standards, I think would be a pretty easy place to start.
Yeah, I think maybe bringing Mike in on this. Something Mike told me many years ago. We talked about a behaviour. So you can build a B-rated house or an A-rated house, but if you put someone in that's behaviour is wrong, it won't obviously achieve that. And Mike told me many years ago is that you have to make as many of these things automatic and take it away from the person so that the building does it for you, if you like. So a real simple one, we're building every house in the country still has light switches rather than movement detectors, which it's simple technology. Been around. We've been doing it in offices and in commercial buildings for years and years and years, but we don't do it in domestic properties. Mike, do you want to just comment upon that and behaviour and how important behaviour is to this?
I think it's the best impact I've ever had was that you remembered that over these years.
I tell people all the time, Mike, I still talk about it.
But you're exactly right. I mean, if you look at theories of behavior change, many of my colleagues, Catherine Brown, Katie Newby, Neil Howlett in psychology, they work on behavior change. They work on behavior change things for health and things, where the consequences for someone if they don't change their behavior could be that they die. Right. And they find it difficult to shift the dial by 5 or 6 or 7%, getting people to exercise or whatever, or to eat the right things. So behavior change is difficult, right? But therefore, I think I absolutely agree with the spirit of what you're saying, Ian, well, if that's not a backhanded compliment to myself, of course, because we've talked about it. That what's the point in how, you can put turn it off sticker next to a light switch as many times as you like, but after the first time someone's seen it, they simply won't see it again after that. And you're right, we have the technology that the light will go off 5 minutes after the last person has left the room, completely automatically. This is the engineer in me taking over from the psychologist, really. So let's not bother about trying to sort of do a leaflet campaign to persuade people to turn off lights. We'll just turn them off 5 minutes after they've left. I would retain the switch so that they have to turn it on when they come back in. So that, sometimes you just want to pop back into a room. You don't want it coming on for 15 minutes automatically. So I would have it asymmetric in that way, but that's a small detail. And there are lots of other things. When we built the Cube project, our intention was that you could live in this cube or the larger version of it without ever knowing that you were being particularly eco-friendly, because everything worked. You turn the lights on, the lights came on. The fact is they were using 1/5 of the energy of the old lights, which also used to come on. And you wouldn't need to know that. So I agree. We want to use engineering and where we can, we want to use behavior change where we can. But sometimes the behavior change we need is the one that John and Nameerah have pointed out, is at the policy level. The behavior change we need is up there to force or encourage people, but possibly in the end force people to use things that are efficient at the implementation level. And as long as we don't require people, as long as we allow people to make huge amounts of money, 40–50% profit margins by doing the wrong thing, and then we put our hands in the air and say, why are people doing the wrong thing? And on a global scale, I absolutely take Nameerah's point that this is even more so against Nameerah's point. And I welcome, although, we shouldn't have to be hearing from middle-aged white men like me. We're hearing from from young female activists from all over the globe. Vanessa Nakate from Uganda, from Greta Thunberg from Sweden, and all the others. Isabel Axelson, lots of them, and it's a great and encouraging thing. But those people can't do it by themselves. They need people at the top to enable change, and maybe through self-build and things that we're looking into. Sorry, that was a rant.
Thank you, Mike. Nameerah, I had a question. In our move towards greener energy, and unfortunately something that is obviously on the rise is storage and batteries, and are we creating a problem with another natural resource like lithium, for example, which is going to have to be mined more? There's going to be a greater demand on storage. So are we solving one problem with, say, gas or coal, but we've actually got another natural resource that we're going to have to start to rely on much heavier? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Are you on mute, Nameerah? Maybe we've lost Nameerah.
She can't hear very clearly. She says it's a very shaky connection. So I'm wondering if we need to maybe pop that question in the chat and see if she can come back a bit later, maybe.
No, thank you. I don't know, Mike, if you have any thoughts around that and the rise of batteries and storage.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I got to towards the end of my talk, and we'd like to do this in our, like John said, we'd like to do some experimental buildings on some of the university estate, not necessarily at Hatfield, but maybe at our hub at Bayfordbury, is to investigate actually stuff that's fairly low tech. Actually, you can have a lithium ion battery, it's expensive, but it's very efficient. Or you can have a pumped water storage reservoir in the Glen of Scotland, which is much, much cheaper, a tenth of the cost, but it needs a bit of engineering. Or you can have a tank of hot water. Now, that's in a temperate climate like ours. The other things that you would do in the global south, for instance, in places with different climates, you'd have appropriate levels of technology. There, you might not need so much insulation or something like that because the ambient temperature is higher, but you need shade, you need refrigeration, and we've been working even this week with a company called Africa Power Limited, where we're looking into sort of appropriate technology. So it's not always the high tech that does it. And you mentioned it yourself, Ian, just the very low tech of an infrared detector that turns off the lights. People are talking about, oh, well, have we got chance for nuclear fusion to ride to the rescue, like the 7th Cavalry in a Western film? Well, yes, if we got nuclear fusion, then it would be a very good thing. But why are we waiting to see whether we get it when for 30 years we've had technologies that we haven't used that we could easily deploy?
No, definitely.
Just come in on
briefly
on that, and again, just to emphasize what Mike was saying. This is not a UK only problem, but this year the technology questions are really interesting. When I was just thinking back to some work I did in Darjeeling in northeast India a few years ago, where we were out sort of working with local NGOs and looking at the planning process out there and the development process. And they talked about a phenomenon which is equally happens here in the UK, that politicians tend to like big, shiny infrastructure things. So they like a big power station or an airport, or in the internationally. And in the Darjeeling case, they were saying there were various problems about energy and things, but in terms of water, for example, which I know isn't our topic, but it's related. Rather than trying to gather water as it fell on the town of Darjeeling, as it often did, before it went down the valley, they would not bother with that. It would run down the valley into the river, and then they were looking at building a big pumping station to pump it back up the top again, because a politician wanted to cut the ribbon on a pumping station and say, look, we've got a pumping station. Fine, but that's incredibly expensive and energy intensive and etc. Whereas lower cost human scale interventions, like just catching water as it falls, which obviously you can do anywhere, is much more is much easier to do, quicker, cheaper, and possibly as effective. And that applies across the board with any kind of intervention like this. That say politicians want the big shiny thing, but often what's equally effective and certainly cheaper is smaller scale community type activity, but doesn't have, you know, if a politician can't be cutting a ribbon on it, then they're less likely to say that it's a great thing. They need a baby to kiss, or a thing to stand in front of, or whatever, for it to get that kind of, you know, political interest, I think.
No, agreed. We have another question in the Q&A, actually, maybe one I'll pick up about, that goes back to Mike's discussion about using sustainable materials in construction, and does it result in reducing construction waste? And I think Zoe would like to come in on this one as well. So something we've seen in construction over the last 10 years is construction waste streams is very well managed on a project these days, and actually they do divert many things away from landfill, and really are very successful in that, and have a very, very good waste site management plan. So I don't believe sustainable materials massively reduce the amount of waste, because unfortunately packaging, etc., is too much on most products, whether they're green or not, unfortunately. But I do think the construction industry does manage it better. I think one thing the construction industry can do better, though, is reducing embodied energy by looking at more refurbishment and less new build. Zoe, did you want to come in on this question as well?
Sorry, Ian, I just submitted it so that it was to be answered live. It doesn't mean that I want to contribute. No worries.
Yeah, as I say, Mike, you did quite a lot of research on sustainable products when you did the Cube, and
yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. I mean, the cube was basically made of wood. I mean, the interior surfaces, the walls of the cubes, and you can see them on the video on cubeproject.org.uk, were actually 18mm plywood, which was a surface, an interior wall surface, which was beloved of the modernist architects of the Bauhaus and beyond, and even of the 1950s. All the sort of a lot of the sort of pin-up architecture you see from mid-century modern buildings that everybody loves these days, a lot of that actually used wooden ceilings, wooden surfaces on the inside, which takes away a whole need for a whole lot of wet trades using high carbon embodied materials like lime and cement and plaster and things like that, all of which have got very high carbon dioxide. You saw cement was at the bottom of my graph on the first graph I showed with emissions. It's a very big because you start with calcium carbonate, and the first thing you do is use heat with the carbon dioxide fuel to drive the carbon dioxide off the calcium carbonate to make calcium oxide. So, you know, that's the first thing you do. So these materials, and people said to me, oh, well, you don't want a wooden paneled wall. Well, actually, some of the most luxurious things we ever thought of as sort of corporate offices and things had wooden paneled walls. It's just a way of thinking that we've tied ourselves into, oh, well, everything's got to be plasterboard, gypsum, wet materials, high cost work, instead of just nailing a plasterboard, a piece of plywood, or not quite nailing, but you know what I mean. So it's a design issue. It's a design issue. You design the right thing. It's just as easy to put solar panels as make up the whole of a roof as it is to do slates. It's not even more expensive when you factor the fact that you're going to get 25 years of energy out of them. So none of this is problematic in principle. It just doesn't seem to be done in practice, and that is the frustration.
Oh, definitely. I think as we've got about 5 minutes left, I've got one sort of final question for each of our panelists, and hopefully Nameerah can come in. But if I just ask each of you the same question, and I'll start maybe with you, John, what would be your magic wand moment? What would be the one thing that you would do if you had a magic wand to move us forward? What would be your one item?
I think I would empower, both in terms of legislation and finance, local authorities to do more, to be able to buy land and provide the infrastructure on it, and then sell off plots to individuals and to individual house builders, like happens in in the Netherlands and other countries, rather than to separate the land acquisition and building process. Because, as I said, I think that bringing those two together in the development process just means that is how developers make money. If you separate them out, that forces people building houses to build better houses if they want to sell them.
Yeah, that's good. Really good answer. Thanks, John. Nameerah, can you hear us, or are you unable to hear us? No, I don't think we've got Nameerah. So Mike, gives you the last word, and I'm going to give you the magic wand. And
well, I could say that my magic wand is to put Johnsterzeker, Professor Sturzaker, in charge of planning for the UK and the world. But you know, that's because I'm so pleased that John has joined us recently, and that there's so much to be said for taking not just his modern perspective, but the historical perspective that the name of his chair takes us back to. The Ebenezer Howard Chair of Planning takes us back to something that started in Hertfordshire. You know, the Letchworth Garden City, Welwyn Garden City, not far from where I am, but I'm not in it because I can't afford it, but Hampstead Garden Suburb. You know, this was a vision that first saw its realization in Hertfordshire. And this is a vision that is still relevant today. And the things that were said then are the things. So my magic wand would be to put people like John and other good people that we've heard of, you know, that we work with in Hertfordshire County Council and other places, give them more agency to do what they really want to do, which is to enable people. I would enable much more self-build, as John says, with incentives for people to make the right choices, because they will make the right choices because they know they're going to be paying the electricity bill for the next 30 years. A developer doesn't make that right choice because they know that somebody else is going to be paying the electricity bill. And not only that, somebody else will be paying for the retrofit when we have to make the whole fleet of houses zero carbon by 2040 or whatever it is. So those would be my magic wands. I'd just put John in charge. That's what I would do.
Excellent. And would you be his deputy, Mike?
No, I was hoping you would come in and be the project manager, Ian.
Excellent, thank you so much. I'm really sorry we can't get through to Nameerah, but I think as we start to close, I just want to sum up really. I think it's been three really interesting subjects. I think from housing through global impact, which Nameerah spoke to us about, and I think as John and Mike just mentioned, for Hertfordshire to be at the centre of this, I think we really got a really important position as a university to play, but also as a county. You know, Hertfordshire is known as the county of opportunity, and there's no better opportunity than actually making a real impact with sustainability and helping to decarbonise the county and then the bigger UK picture and then the global picture as well. And I think it's fantastic that this conference is happening today and last week and next week. And I'm sure that there'll be many people that will all learn something, and we can all take something away from what we've heard today. So thank you very much to our speakers. I just want to remind the participants that there's another session today at 3 o'clock, and we're going to hear from Unibus, again, another part of the University of Hertfordshire business, very close to our hearts. And I think it's Ed Cameron from UNO, and also being joined by Trevor Brennan from Hertfordshire County Council and Professor Stephen Joseph, who's a Sustainable Transport Advisor. So a real transport themed session this afternoon, which I'm sure will be really interesting, and hopefully many of you will join. So I'd just lastly say again, thank you to all of our speakers, John, Mike and Nameerah, and I hope that was entertaining and everybody has taken away a learn from today. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Zoe and Nana.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you.